Hello, and welcome to the last set of lectures for this class. This will be Chapter 10, and we'll be taking a look at muscle tissue, and in particular, we're going to focus on skeletal muscle tissue. So this is Chapter 10, and we have a set of lecture objective set questions as well as vocabulary list. You should probably have already downloaded those and begin to take a look at them. We also have a large number of lecture handouts. So you will have to have those with you as you go through these lectures. This first presentation that I'm going to do, I'm not going to be using any of the handouts. So if you don't have them at the moment, that's okay. Make sure you have them for the following presentations and sessions on this chapter. So as you know, the objective set questions are going to cover everything that you need to know. So there are a number of them. As you can see, we have 3 pages of questions concerning this chapter, and we're going to spend a lot of time looking at various aspects of how muscle produces movement in the body. So what I'd like to start off with is a very brief review of the different types of muscle tissues that we have in your body. Now, this would be probably around the 3rd or 4th time you've heard this. That's okay. We're going to just very briefly talk about it here in the beginning of this session. And then for the rest of the time, we'll be focusing on skeletal muscle tissue. So let's talk about, this will be Chapter 10. And this is all about muscle tissue. And we're going to cover the different types of muscle tissue first. So, types of muscle tissue. And as you know by now, I hope, you have 3 different types. So, 3 types of muscle tissue. And the first one we'll talk about is skeletal muscle tissue. And again, this is just to sketch in some of the details that we've already been talking about. We're going to go in and look at skeletal muscle tissue in a lot more detail. So we're only going to hit the highlights here. So in your chapter, this is actually from Chapter 4. We've seen this image before. Typical skeletal muscle tissue consists of long, cylindrical, striated muscle cells, and they are multinucleated. The nuclei are found out at the periphery. We have this pattern of light and dark, which gives us the striations that we use to describe this type of muscle, and it is voluntary. So let's get that into our notes. So it is typically attached to bones. Okay. It moves the skeletal system. Okay. But it also moves skin. And it can also move other muscles. And it can also have an influence on the movement of what we call fascia, which is a type of connective tissue surrounding different parts of our body. So skeletal muscle is attached to bone, moves skeletal system, as well as skin and muscle and fascia. It is striated. It is multinucleated. And the nuclei are on the periphery. Okay. And it is voluntary. So all again, really very quick review of things that we already know. That's skeletal muscle tissue. Let's talk a little bit about cardiac muscle tissue next. As you know, cardiac muscle tissue is going to be covered in a whole chapter in the textbook later on. That's going to be in 40B. So we're not going to spend a lot of time here talking about it. We're just going to hit the highlights. So the next type of muscle tissue, number 2 on our list, is cardiac muscle tissue. This is found in the heart wall. In fact, it makes up most of the heart wall. It is also striated. It is what we term has uninucleated. And that is a 1 or 2 at the most. Okay. It is involuntary. It also has this quality about it, which is very important. It can spontaneously depolarize. And the importance of that, we'll leave that discussion for 40B, but it is a very important property of this type of muscle tissue. So it spontaneously depolarizes. Okay? The term that is used to describe this kind of behavior is autorhythmic. Gosh and golly. So it has autorhythmicity. Right. A centrally located nucleus. It is branched. And it has these unusual connections between cells, the intercalated discs. Unusual in the sense that we see this only a few places in the body, particularly in the heart. All right, so number 2, cardiac muscle tissue. And again, we can take a quick peek at that. So this is what it would look like. We can see the intercalated disc. We can see it's striated. We have centrally located nuclei. We have branching of the cells. And so it is involuntary and spontaneously depolarizes. So it can contract. The muscles contract without outside stimulation. Basically is what that term means and what that is describing. And as I said, it's an important property of the heart, and we'll have a long discussion about that. I won't, but you will later on in 40B when you look at the heart and how it behaves. So that's the last type of muscle is smooth muscle. And this is number 3 on our list. So 3. It's located in the walls of hollow internal structures such as blood vessels and hollow organs such as the stomach, classic example. The uterus would be another example of that. Okay. It is also attached to hairs, right? The hair follicles. It is non-striated. The shape of the cell is spindle shape. It has a centrally located nucleus. It is non-voluntary. And some of the cells are or have this property of autorhythmicity. I'm having so much trouble with that word. Autorhythmicity, involuntary. Okay. And once again, we can take a look at a couple of pictures. It helps us visualize this. So here's a nice picture of a single, and we get this right eventually, of a single cell. You can see the shape. This is what we would call spindle shape. We see that there are no striations. Notice that we have something that they're identifying as thick and thin filaments. We'll be discussing those when we look at skeletal muscle. So the proteins that are actually causing the cell to contract are the same proteins we see in skeletal muscle and the same proteins we see in heart muscle. So the mechanism in which a muscle cell is shortening, whether it's skeletal or cardiac or smooth muscle, is all the same. The arrangement of those proteins are different between this smooth muscle tissue and the other two types, skeletal muscle and cardiac muscle tissue. So we don't have that striation pattern because the way these proteins are laid out is not the same, so we don't get the same pattern. So that's how a smooth muscle cell would look. If you take a look at this image, slightly different picture of the same thing. And here, of course, they're showing us location. So smooth muscle, as I mentioned, we find that in the wall of hollow structures such as arteries. Again, we get this spindle shape. Most of the cells are formed in sheets. And again, we get that spindle shape, centrally located nuclei. And some of these cells will, in fact, be able to spontaneously depolarize. And that should be discussed in 40C when you're looking at the digestive system. Okay. All right, so that's a very quick overview of the three different types of muscle tissue. We're going to talk about the functions of muscle tissue, and then we're going to focus for the rest of this time in this chapter on skeletal muscle and leave the other behind. So let's talk about functions of muscle tissue. What is the purpose of this tissue in our body? How does it help us maintain homeostasis? And as we'll see, there are 5 main functions. And the first one, number 1, is movement of the body. Okay. So walking and running and swimming and dancing and doing all the things that we do when we move our body. This movement, the movement of the body, requires more than the skeletal muscle system. Obviously, the skeletal system itself is involved, but it requires quite a bit of coordination. So, requires the integration of a number of systems. Number one, the nervous system. And we're going to talk about that connection today in today's lecture. That's the neuromuscular junction. Number two, the skeletal system. Number three, the skeletal muscle system. So all three of these have to be coordinated in order to produce body movement. That's number one. Number two is movement within the body. Movement within the body. So, and this plays out in a number of different ways. So, for example, movement of blood. Okay. And the systems that are involved, the muscle systems that are involved in this, obviously would be the heart. So that would be cardiac muscle tissue. But also smooth muscle is playing a role here. As well as skeletal muscle. It's easy to think about just simply the heart as pumping blood, but the other two muscle systems are also playing a role. Smooth muscle controlling, for example, the diameter of blood vessels, and thus directing blood flow into different parts of the body, also helping to maintain blood pressure. Skeletal muscle is being used as a secondary pump. So many of the arteries and veins are sitting in between muscles. And particularly the veins, this is important because when the muscles are being used, of course, as we saw with the smooth muscle, they bunch up, they bulge. And if two muscles are being used and there is a vein in between them and they bulge, they squeeze on that vein. And by squeezing on that vein, they're actually acting as a pump, pushing blood that is collected in that vein towards the heart. So you'll learn more about that when you get into the cardiovascular system. So movement of blood in the body. Also, of course, movement of food. And here, once again, we're going to have different systems of muscles, different components of muscles. Obviously, we're going to be using smooth muscle. That's going to be controlling movement within the digestive system, the stomach, the large intestine, the small intestine. But we have to chew our food, don't we? And we have to swallow that food, and that's skeletal muscle. So again, we have an integration of different types of muscle tissue acting to move something within the body. So movement of food within the body. Gametes. It's another example. So gametes, of course, are the eggs and the sperm, and this is primarily smooth muscle. That's going to control the movement of gametes within the body. Urine. The flow of urine through the body is also being controlled by smooth muscle primarily. So the urinary bladder, the wall of the urinary bladder is composed of smooth muscle tissue. But there is also a component of skeletal muscle tissue in that we have sphincter muscles that are controlling the release of urine out of the body. And those are, in part, skeletal muscle tissue. Okay. And of course, there are other substances too. Just to give you an example, bile. This is something that's being produced by the liver, stored in the gallbladder. The movement of that is also dependent upon the contraction of smooth muscle. So, a number of different things, movement within the body. Number 4. Was that number? Let's see, movement. Yeah, this would be number 4. Wait a minute, that doesn't sound right. So, movement of the body, movement within the body. This is number 3. Number 3. This is going to be posture control. Okay. Posture control. So, keeping our head up, standing, sitting, these kinds of things. This is not movement, it's having a stationary position that you maintain. So, sitting, standing, whatever. Very important. Can you imagine walking around with your head down and not looking at where you're going? So that's a classic and very good example of how posture is very important for your survival. And of course, this is going to be skeletal muscle. Number 4, control of body cavities. So there's a number of body cavities that you are using muscles to control the movement of substances from one body cavity to another. And just to give you some examples, food, urine, and a number of other different substances. So this is going to be skeletal muscle. And smooth muscle. This is a very important aspect of the biology of your body, particularly in the digestive system. So your ability to create different cavities or different spaces within the digestive system allows you to be efficient at the digestion and absorption of your meal. Instead of having one large cavity where everything takes place, you can now have several different cavities: the stomach, the small intestine, the large intestine, and each of those can be specialized for different types of activities. And the only way that can happen is if you're able to close off each of those sections from the others and create that special environment by controlling the movement of materials from the small intestine into the large intestine, or from the stomach into the small intestine. Okay, so control of body cavities, very important aspect of the muscle systems in your body. Number 5, thermal regulation, which is a very fancy way of saying producing heat. Okay. And the term for production of heat is thermogenesis. So about 85% of your total body heat is the result of the energy that's coming out of the muscle system. So the muscle, and primarily skeletal muscle, is producing about 85% of the total body heat that you as a human produce. So how much energy is that? Well, I've heard this figure. Each human being is about the equivalent of a 150 watt light bulb. So if you have ever, and these are the old style light bulbs, of course, so they generate a fair amount of heat. If you get close to one, you can actually feel that heat coming off. That's why large auditoriums and other places, they heat up quite rapidly when you get a lot of people in there, because each of those individuals is producing quite a bit of heat on their own. And 85% of that is coming out of the skeletal muscle system, as well as some other cardiac muscle tissue contributes some, smooth muscle contributes some, but most of that is coming from the skeletal muscle system. And that's why, for example, when you get cold, you're shivering. And shivering is a way to generate heat without actually producing movement. So generating heat using your muscles without actually moving anything. So thermogenesis and the regulation of heat in your body. Okay. All right, so that's the functions, how the muscle system contributes to the overall homeostasis of your body. What I want to talk about now is some characteristics of muscle tissue. So let's write that down and let's talk a little bit about what we're about to talk about. So characteristics of muscle tissue. Okay. So these characteristics kind of define muscle tissue. You remember back when we were talking about epithelial tissue and connective tissue, and we listed a bunch of things that we associate with each of those. For example, epithelial tissue, we have sheets of densely packed cells. We have different size cells. We had the columnar and the cuboidal and so forth and so on. And we listed a whole bunch of characteristics for each of those types of tissues. This is a very similar thing that we're doing here. And we're not so much describing the physical appearance, because we've already done that when we looked at those three different types of muscle tissue. We're looking at some of the way in which this behaves, some of the behavioral characteristics of muscle tissue. Okay, and so there are in fact 4 characteristics. And the first one is excitability. Okay. Excitability is the ability to react to a stimulus. Okay, so the ability to react to a stimulus. It responds to stimuli. Okay. Sometimes this idea, this characteristic, is expressed in a slightly different way. Sometimes you'll hear this word irritability. I think that this word is not as accurate or as good as excitability. Irritability is another way to describe this idea that you're responding to some stimuli. Okay, what is the stimuli? The stimuli can be a number of different things. It can be chemicals. So, for example, a neurotransmitter released and binding to a muscle cell can cause it to react, to respond to that stimulus. Or it can be hormones. Which is another form of chemical. So it is, in fact, a chemical, but I'm pulling it out and indicating just to make sure that... So this would be more like a neurotransmitter. Hormones are something slightly different, although they are obviously chemicals. Also physical stress. Smooth muscle, for example, when you suddenly stretch it, its reaction is to contract against that stretching. So there are different forms of stimuli. So physical stress, hormones, chemicals such as neurotransmitters. Okay. Once excited, once that cell has become excited, within this idea of excitability is another aspect, and that would be conductivity. So sometimes people will list this as a separate idea or concept. Your textbook doesn't. But conductivity is the ability to propagate an action potential. And once again, we're using a term here that we haven't yet defined. And we really are not going to define this until we get to 40B. We will take a crack at it so we understand something about it, because we'll be talking about it when we look at how we're going to get a muscle to contract. And we'll have to talk about action potential at that point. But once it's excited, once it's responding to a stimulus, it will conduct or propagate an action potential throughout that cell. Okay, so that's the idea of excitability. That's number one. Number two would be contractility. So number two here is going to be contractility. And contractility is just what it sounds like, the ability to shorten. Okay. When it shortens, it also thickens. Okay. So you know this, when you're showing off your muscles, you're going to contract the muscle so it bulges, show everybody how large your muscles are. And this is what generates force. This is how we produce movement. This is how we control movement between, say, the stomach and the small intestine. This is how we move when we walk. We're going to generate force as the muscles shorten. They generate force. And that contractility is in response to a stimulus of some sort, which we have already defined. So first we stimulate the muscle, and its reaction is a contraction. And that's all muscles can do. Muscles cannot do anything more than contract. They cannot, on their own, stretch back out once they're contracted. So once a muscle has contracted, it's stuck in that contracted condition until some outside force is going to act on it and stretch it back out. So that's why many of the muscles you may have noticed that we are learning about are doing opposite types of actions. So we talked about muscles that flex the forearm. We talked about a muscle that extend the forearm. So once the muscles that are flexing the forearm have contracted, they're stuck in that position, that contracted position. And in order for them to be stretched back out so they can contract once again, you're going to have to use another muscle, the triceps brachii, in fact, to stretch or to extend the lower arm so that you can flex it again. So once a muscle has shortened, it's done until some outside force has acted on it to stretch it back out, and then it can contract again. Okay? So contractility, that's where we're going to generate force. The third characteristic is extensibility. And extensibility is the ability to be stretched. So without tissue damage. So lots of things can be stretched. The question is, can they be stretched without damage? And this is true for muscle tissue. So we contract and then we can stretch it again without damaging the muscle. So extensibility is a very important property of muscles, because without that, if you were to stretch your muscles, things like simply stretching, you could easily damage them if they didn't have this characteristic of being able to stretch without damage. Okay. And finally, a fourth property, and this is elasticity. And elasticity speaks to the ability to return to the original shape after contraction. Or stretching. Like a rubber band. You can stretch a rubber band, and then you release the tension on the rubber band, and it can snap back to its original shape. So elasticity is that property that we're describing in that situation. All right, so those are the not the physical characteristics, but the physiological characteristics, if you will, of muscle tissue. And what we're going to talk about now is we're going to start describing and getting into actual skeletal muscle tissue and describing its shape, form, structure, anatomy, and so forth. So from now on, the conversation is going to be exclusively about skeletal muscle tissue. All right, so let's begin with an image, and we'll come back to this image multiple times, but we'll start with it and then get something in our notes and then come back and look at it again. So here is an image of typical muscle attached to bone. You can see it's bone. We have a tendon. And what we see when we look at muscle tissue is that we are going to wrap, or your body's going to wrap, that muscle tissue in a series of layers of connective tissue. And we have seen, or we're seeing some of those being listed right here: epimysium, perimysium, endomysium. These are some of the layers that we're about to talk about, and each of those is covering a different aspect of the muscle and the muscle cells. So let's begin that discussion, and we'll start off with listing the structures first, and talking about a little bit about each one of those. So let's head this up as the anatomy of skeletal muscle. That's going to be the big story here. Anatomy of skeletal muscle. Okay. And we're going to look at the coverings of muscle tissue. So we're going to do connective tissue associated with muscle tissue. So it turns out that muscle tissue, or more properly, skeletal muscle tissue, is surrounded and encased in connective tissue. So hopefully by now you're kind of getting this picture that your body loves to wrap things. And that is very true. It does. It likes to wrap things. Why? Because by wrapping things, you're controlling and you're producing controlled spaces. So if you wrap bone tissue, for example, now that bone tissue is a controlled space, and you can create the kind of environment that you want within that controlled space. Same thing is happening here. We're producing controlled spaces within skeletal muscle and with skeletal muscle itself. So this connective tissue is referred to as a as fascia. That's the term, fascia. And there are several layers. And we'll list them and then we'll talk about them. Number 1, superficial. Fascia. Hopefully that's ringing a bell to you. We did mention this term when we're looking at the skin, the integumentary system. Deep fascia. And then the next 3 are not termed fascia. They have their own names. The epimysium. Number 4, the perimysium. So I've heard it pronounced epimysium, epimysium. I don't really care. You can go whatever you want. Just know what it is and how it works. So superficial fascia, deep fascia, epimysium, perimysium, endomysium. We'll start with the superficial fascia and then work our way down. So this is from superficial to deep. So superficial fascia first. The superficial fascia has several names. What are they? Also called, hoping you're saying out loud to yourself now what the other names are, hypodermis, and subcutaneous layer. Both of those are proper terms. So 3 different ways to referring to the same thing. And really, which term you choose depends on your focus. So in this case, we're focusing on muscle tissue. So we're calling it the superficial fascia. Okay. This is obviously going to be deep to the skin. And it is composed of, hopefully you know this already, areolar connective tissue, and adipose tissue. How is this related to muscle tissue? What is its relationship to muscle tissue? And the answer to that is under functions. It is a place where we can store fat and water. It is a way to reduce heat loss. Remember, muscle tissue is producing 85% of our total body heat, so this is a layer that helps that muscle tissue to do its job, maintaining our high internal temperatures. Okay. Also provides mechanical protection to muscle tissue. What do I mean by mechanical protection? I mean when you bump into something or you're struck by something, you fall down, the layer of fat that is embedded or part of this layer, this superficial fascia, is going to absorb some of the energy from that, and that protects the muscle tissue. Okay, and it also finally is a framework for nerves and blood vessels that are going to serve muscle tissue. So they're on their way to muscle tissue, and we're gonna embed them into this layer first as they go deeper and eventually reach muscle tissue. So superficial fascia. The next layer is the deep fascia. So this would be number 2, the deep fascia. And this layer is directly related to muscle tissue. So let me just explain that statement, because we were talking about the superficial fascia and we were talking about it in relationship to muscles, and all of a sudden I'm saying now this layer is directly related to muscle tissue. What am I trying to say here? What I'm saying is if you don't have muscle tissue, you're not going to have deep fascia. You can have the hypodermis, you can have the superficial fascia without having muscle tissue underneath it. So that can cover, for example, surfaces that are just bony surfaces, like your shin. It does relate to muscle tissue in the ways that we just described in terms of the function, but it's not dependent on the presence of muscle tissue to be present itself. Here, the deep fascia is going to only be present when you have muscle tissue. Okay? So this is dense, irregular, connective tissue. And what it's going to do is it's going to align body wall and limbs and hold functional muscle groups together. So it holds functional muscle groups together. So more than one muscle. So we have to talk about what is a functional muscle group. A functional muscle group is a group of muscles that are essentially doing the same thing, producing the same movement. And a classic example of that, a very excellent class, would be the quadriceps. So the vastus medialis, vastus lateralis, vastus intermedius, and the rectus femoris. Those are 4 muscles, all connected to the same structure, the tibial tuberosity, and producing the same movement. So they are a functional group. And that functional group would be wrapped up and held together by the deep fascia. It is also going to fill the space between muscles. So it can act as a filler for the spacing that happens as you bring 2 muscles or more than 2 muscles together. And finally, it also, just as we saw with the superficial fascia, is going to support nerves and blood vessels. And we might as well throw this in for good measure, lymphatic vessels. So once again, I'll remind you that when we talk about blood vessels, even if we don't mention the fact or mention lymphatic vessels, they are there. So in this case, I am listing them in particular, but for example, when I just listed the framework for nerves and blood vessels in the previous layer, we could have added lymphatic vessels because blood vessels always are accompanied with lymphatic vessels. All right. So those are the first 2 layers. Now we're going to get into the next 3 layers, and this would be number 3 here in our list, and that would be the epimysium or mesium, depending on how you want to pronounce that. So this is going to be an extension of the deep fascia. Okay. It is, of course, then dense irregular connective tissue. And what this does is it surrounds or encircles whole muscles. So one muscle is surrounded by the epimysium. Again, this is simply an extension of the deep fascia, except now we're wrapping a single muscle rather than a group of muscles. The next layer is the perimysium. And this is going to be, once again, it's an extension of the epimysium. And this is going to surround bundles of individual muscle cells. So within the muscle, it's going to bundle up groups of muscle cells. So another term is muscle fibers. One and the same thing. Muscle cell, muscle fiber, same thing. So what we're going to do is we're going to bundle up into groups muscle fibers. So bundles of muscle fibers. And these bundles can range in size from 10 to 100 or more. Okay. In each bundle, is called a fascicule. So we've wrapped the muscle, and then muscles, of course, are made up of many different individual muscle cells. And so what we're going to take is we're going to bundle up some of those muscle cells into groups, and that's going to be the perimysium. And then the next one is the endomysium or endomysium. And this is now areolar connective tissue. So up until now, we've talked about dense irregular connective tissue. This is areolar connective tissue. And this is going to wrap individual muscle cells. So this is more than one muscle cell, and this is one muscle cell. Okay. So we have this wrapping, this bundling, kind of like those Russian and Ukrainian nesting dolls, where you get one inside the other, inside the other, inside the other. Okay. Finally, the last thing we can say about this is that the extension of all three layers, the epimysium, the perimysium, the endomysium, all three of those extend off the end of a muscle cell and create the tendons. So, all three layers. The epimysium, the perimysium, and the endomysium or mesium, extend off the ends of muscle cells and produce the tendons of a muscle. Okay. So let's do this. Let's try to image this in a picture. I've always had difficulty doing this, but we're going to try again. Okay. So I have 3 muscle cells here. And let me get another group. So now I've got 2 groups of 3. And the first thing we're going to do is the epimysium. So I'm going to go ahead and I'm going to do in blue that. And you notice that I'm extending it off the ends of the cells. Okay. So this is going to be my epimysium. But now I'm going to wrap the 2 groups of 3. So I'm going to take this, and I'm going to take this, and I'm going to do this. And again, I notice that I'm extending off the end here. And let's just bring that so we can make this clear. Okay. So I've wrapped now the groups, and that's going to be the perimysium. So this is my perimysium. And then I want to wrap each individual cell. And here, let's go ahead and use orange. This is where it gets a little bit difficult. And that is the best we're going to do with that. So let's go ahead and yellow. That's going to be the endomysium. And so now I have a tendon and a tendon. One of those is the tendon of origin, one of those is tendon of insertion. So this becomes my what? The body or belly of the muscle, and then I have my tendons. Okay. And that's how that arrangement works. All right. So one more piece of information we're going to add to this story, and then we'll call it a day. We're going to talk a little bit about blood and nerves, and then we'll call a halt, and we'll do the rest in the following sessions. All right, let's talk about that then. Blood and nerves. So it's probably pretty obvious, and remember, we're talking about skeletal muscle tissue, so I'm not writing that out, but that's what we've been talking about. So muscle has many nerves and blood vessels. A lot of nerves and a lot of blood vessels are supplying our skeletal muscle system. Why? So, blood vessels are going to supply the things that we need in order to sustain work, sustain muscle contractions. So they're going to supply oxygen, they're going to supply nutrients, and here we're talking about sugar, glucose in particular, okay? And remove waste. Very important aspect of what's happening in muscle tissue. So it's a very expensive proposition to produce a muscle contraction. It requires a large amount of energy, lots of ATP. And the best way to generate ATP is the use of oxygen to burn sugar, glucose. In that process, you're generating a lot of waste. So all those things have to happen, and the blood vessels then are going to be responsible for making sure that that can take place. So we need an extensive blood supply to address those needs. Okay. The capillaries are located in the endomysium. That is the layer surrounding cells. So each individual cell is going to have an extensive capillary bed around it in order to accomplish the task of supplying oxygen and sugars and removing waste for that individual cell. Nerves, on the other hand, also very extensive. And that is because we are going to need to stimulate every single cell in the skeletal muscle system if we want it to work. So each muscle fiber, and here, to remind you, we're talking about cell, is connected to the nervous system. Without that connection, that muscle cell would be useless. If we cut that connection between the nervous system and a skeletal muscle cell, we are not going to be able to use that skeletal muscle cell. That's what happens, for example, if you damage your spinal cord and you lose the use of your legs. You've cut that connection between the muscles in your leg and the nervous system, and you don't have any control over them. So each muscle fiber, each muscle cell is connected to the nervous system, which means that you have an extensive nerve system. Okay? So the control, or the organization, that's a better word, the organization of this connection between nerves and muscle tissue is based on what is called a motor unit. So let's talk about a motor unit. So the organizational unit is called a motor unit. What is a motor unit? This you should memorize. This is something that you absolutely need to know. A motor unit is a motor neuron and all of the muscle fibers it stimulates. Okay? That is a motor unit. A motor neuron and all of the muscle fibers it stimulates. Let me draw a couple of examples for you. So I'm going to draw here, let's say that's a muscle fiber, another muscle fiber, another muscle fiber. And I'm in a little separation here because I want to make a point. Okay, so now I'm going to bring in a neuron, a motor neuron. Here's my motor neuron, and I'm going to branch here, here, and here. So that's going to be one. And now I'm going to bring in another one. Another motor neuron here and here. So how many motor units do I have here? I have 2 motor units. Motor unit 1 and motor unit 2. This is in the same muscle. Okay? This is one muscle. I have 2 motor units. One consisting of 3 cells and one consisting of 2 cells. That's what I've just defined in words. A motor unit and all of the muscle fibers it stimulates. So that motor neuron is stimulating 3 muscle fibers. That is one motor unit. This motor neuron is stimulating only 2, but that is also a motor unit. Yes. So in one muscle. And that's how things are organized inside skeletal muscle cells. Okay. So the average size motor unit is about 150 muscle fibers. That's the average size. But if you think about it, average doesn't necessarily give you a lot of information. It may give you even a skewed idea of what's happening inside that system. Because if I have a class of 20 people and 10 people get 0 on an exam and 10 people get 100%, the average is 50% for that class. But nobody got 50%. So you have to be careful with averages. So let's break this down a little bit more. And let's talk about precision motor units. So these are motor units that are going to allow you to do very precise movements. And here we're going to get as few as 2 or 3 cells for a motor unit. Okay. And in particular, now you might guess where would you get these very small motor units? And that would be, you might guess, the eye. That would be a good guess. But in actuality, larynx is where we get, not that the eye doesn't have precision, small motor units, but the larynx is another place where that happens. The eyes, since we talked about them, the eyes are about 20 to 30 cells for the eyes. Still, pretty precise, but not as precise as a motor unit of 2 or 3 cells. Okay? So precision motor units, smaller number of cells being controlled in order to produce very precise force within that structure. What about if you want power? Let's go for power. Power motor units. Here we're going to get 2,000 muscle fibers in one motor unit. 2,000 or more. And this would be your leg muscles. So it's kind of obvious what's happening here. In the areas of your body where you're not doing brain surgery and you're looking for force and generating a lot of muscle force, you're going to have larger motor units. In areas of the body where you need finer control, you're going to have smaller motor units in the muscles. Okay? So one statement, and we're going to come back to this statement, that we can make, given what we've just described here in terms of the size of motor units, is that the strength of a muscle contraction is dependent And in part, that's an important caveat, in part, on the number of motor units stimulated. So the more motor units you stimulate in a single muscle, the stronger the contraction that's going to take place. There are other things that are also going to adjust the amount of force you apply with a muscle. Motor units is certainly a very important part, but there are also other things as well that are going to characterize how much force a muscle is generating. So, ladies and gentlemen, I think this is a good place to stop. And then in the next session, we'll start to talk about neuromuscular junctions. We'll start looking at how the internal structure of a muscle cell is arranged and the proteins that make that up. And then eventually we'll start talking about an actual muscle contraction once we get the larger picture of how everything is put together. So I'll see you then. I'll see you in session 2. And until then, have a good day.